When President Trump announced his new healthcare reforms, Linda never imagined that the changes would directly affect her. The news was filled with talk of reduced healthcare spending and policy shifts aimed at cutting costs, but Linda, 49, didn't realize how drastically these changes would impact her personal life, until she walked into her pharmacy one fateful afternoon. As she handed the pharmacist her usual prescription for insulin, the pharmacist looked up at her with a hesitant expression. "Ma'am, your insulin costs have gone up significantly. The new policy changes are responsible for the increase," he explained. Linda froze. Her heart sank as the price she had always paid for her insulin nearly doubled. This wasn't just a small increase, this was a substantial hike that Linda couldn't afford. She had relied on Medicare to cover the costs for years, but now, with these new changes, it felt like her lifeline had been severed. The bills were piling up, and there was no way to cover this new expense without making tough sacrifices. The shock of it hit her hard. How could the government change policies that directly affected her health in such a drastic way? Linda had been managing her type 2 diabetes with the help of insulin for years, and it was a routine she had come to rely on. But now, this sudden surge in costs threatened to undo everything she had worked to maintain. As she drove home, the weight of the situation bore down on her. The thought that she might not be able to afford her medication anymore was a nightmare. Without insulin, her diabetes would become uncontrollable. Her blood sugar levels would spike, and the consequences could be severe. She had seen the warning signs before: dizziness, fatigue, and even hospitalization, but she had always managed to keep it under control. But now, it felt like the ground was slipping beneath her. Back at home, Linda sat at the kitchen table, trying to focus on the meal in front of her, but the reality of the situation kept creeping into her thoughts. How could she afford the insulin? What would she do if she couldn't get the medication she needed? She had always been a fighter, but this situation felt different. She felt trapped by circumstances beyond her control. She couldn't stop thinking about the policy change and its immediate effect on her life. The government, with all its reforms and promises of better healthcare, had just pushed her into a corner. She was trying to maintain her health, to live a life with as few restrictions as possible, and now, everything seemed out of reach. Linda knew she needed to find another way to manage her condition. The thought of going without insulin was terrifying, and the idea of relying solely on diet and exercise to control her diabetes felt like a risky gamble. She was already doing everything she could to stay healthy, eating right, exercising regularly, but without the proper medication, could she keep her condition under control? The pressure mounted as she sat at the table, staring at the bills in front of her. There were so many expenses already, and this new cost was pushing her to the edge. She didn't want to have to make impossible choices, either buy the insulin or pay for something else. She had always taken pride in managing her health. But now, with this new financial burden, she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep it up. Linda couldn't escape the overwhelming feeling that she was being left behind in the system, and the announcement by President Trump had made that reality all the more real. The tariff policies and healthcare cuts were supposed to help the country, but for Linda, they were making everything harder. The government's decisions were taking a direct toll on her health, and her peace of mind. As Linda sat in the stillness of the evening, the weight of the situation hung heavily on her. She could feel the tears threatening to well up, but she forced herself to stay calm. What other choice did she have? She could fight this, find alternatives, but could she ever feel secure again in a system that had just failed her? The days that followed were filled with an unsettling quiet. Linda had always been a planner. She had lived her life with careful attention to detail, balancing work, health, and finances with an ease that came from routine. For the past several years, her diabetes had been manageable, thanks in large part to her insulin prescription, which Medicare had covered. She had worked hard to ensure her future was secure, and for a while, it seemed like everything was falling into place. But now, the rug had been pulled out from under her. The new changes to the Medicare program weren't just a minor inconvenience, they were a devastating blow to her already tight budget. Every time Linda opened her purse to pay for groceries, or checked her bills, the question loomed in her mind: how am I going to afford the insulin? She hadn't yet found a way to pay for it, and the thought of going without it was unthinkable. Her usual pharmacy had been helpful, offering her a temporary discount, but that was just a short-term solution. The price was still far too high for Linda to bear long-term. She had already seen a significant reduction in her income after retiring from her full-time job, and now, with these new costs added to her monthly expenses, her financial situation was looking increasingly precarious. One evening, after dinner, Linda sat at her kitchen table, staring at a stack of bills. The low hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room, and Linda's thoughts felt loud against the silence. She knew she had to find a way to adjust, but the options before her felt disheartening. Her first idea was to change her diet. She had always been conscious of what she ate, careful with her carbs, her sugar intake, and always mindful of her meals. But now, Linda began to wonder if changing her diet even further could help. If she could cut out more processed foods, perhaps it would make her insulin dosage less necessary. The thought was appealing, but Linda knew it wouldn't be easy. A healthy diet alone couldn't replace the medication she relied on to stabilize her blood sugar. And even with better eating habits, there was no guarantee her condition wouldn't worsen without the insulin. She thought about her exercise routine. Linda had always been an active person. She walked regularly, practiced yoga, and tried to stay as active as possible. But again, she knew that exercise alone could not replace the insulin. The idea that she might need to rely only on lifestyle changes seemed like a temporary patch at best, an idea that gave her hope, but not a solution to her real problem. Linda could feel the weight of the decision weighing on her. She needed to make a change, but it wasn't clear what that change should be. Should she try to find another insurance provider, one that might offer better coverage? Should she consider a cheaper, alternative medication? She had heard stories about people finding lower-cost insulin options, but she wasn't sure where to start or whether they would be effective. The more she researched, the more confusing the options became. Everything seemed like a gamble. As she sat there, Linda's mind turned to the future. She had planned for a comfortable retirement, but now, every part of that plan felt shaky. Her income was fixed, and the cost of her medications was rising. She had worked so hard for this time of her life, and now, instead of enjoying it, she felt burdened with the weight of financial uncertainty. How could she continue to live independently and enjoy her golden years if she couldn't even afford her basic health needs? Linda began to feel like a pawn in a much larger game, a system that was shifting beneath her feet, leaving her to scramble for ways to stay afloat. The government's decisions, the new healthcare policies, had thrown her life into turmoil. She had always trusted that Medicare would be there for her, a safeguard as she entered her later years. But now, it seemed as though even the safety net was unreliable. She reached for her phone and dialed the number of a local support group for people with diabetes. Maybe they would have some answers, or at least a little guidance. Linda felt a sense of helplessness rise in her chest as she waited for someone to pick up the phone. She needed answers, but more than that, she needed some reassurance that she wasn't alone in this struggle. The line clicked, and a friendly voice answered. "Hello, this is the Diabetes Support Helpline. How can I help you today?" Linda explained her situation, her voice wavering slightly. "I'm struggling to afford my insulin due to the new changes in Medicare. I don't know what to do." The voice on the other end listened patiently, then offered a suggestion. "There may be some programs that can help with the cost of insulin. Have you looked into patient assistance programs or possible local charity resources?" Linda took notes as she listened, a small flicker of hope igniting in her chest. There might be options, after all. But as the conversation came to an end, Linda couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about finding a quick fix. It was about a larger, more systemic problem, a problem she couldn't solve on her own. The days after Linda's phone call with the Diabetes Support Helpline felt long and restless. While she had been given some hope in the form of patient assistance programs, the uncertainty of her situation still lingered. The thought of having to rely on charity or programs just to afford her medication left her unsettled. Was she really going to have to ask for help to stay alive? Every morning, she would wake up and check her blood sugar, just like she always did. But now, there was an added layer of dread to it. Would the numbers be too high? Would her insulin supply last for the next month? Would she be able to pay for it? It wasn't just about her health anymore, it was about her ability to survive financially in a system that seemed more and more like it was set up to fail her. Linda knew she couldn't keep relying on hope. She had to face the reality that her retirement, once a time of peace and relaxation, was now threatened by the rising costs of her medication and the uncertainty surrounding Medicare. The news about the tariff policies and healthcare cuts, though far removed from her daily life, had started to hit too close to home. The announcement had promised to make healthcare more affordable for some, but for Linda, it felt like the exact opposite. The simple act of taking her insulin every day had always been a small but essential part of her life. It was something she could count on, until now. With the new price hikes, the uncertainty about whether she could continue affording it was always there. And that uncertainty began to seep into other parts of her life. One afternoon, Linda was sitting in her small kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee in the air, staring at her monthly budget on the table. She had carefully calculated every penny for the month, but now, with the new costs of insulin looming, it didn't add up. She had already trimmed as much fat from her budget as she could, canceling a few subscriptions, reducing her grocery budget, and cutting down on entertainment costs. But now, there was nothing left to cut. The rent for her apartment, her utilities, her healthcare, they all seemed to consume more of her income than ever before. Linda rubbed her eyes, exhausted from the constant mental gymnastics. The fight to stay afloat was wearing her down. She had worked hard all her life, always paying her bills on time and planning for the future. And yet, now she was here, wondering how she would survive on a fixed income, unsure if she would be able to get the medicine she needed. The fear of the unknown was becoming too much to bear. In the evenings, Linda tried to distract herself. She would go for a walk around her neighborhood or watch TV. Sometimes, she would talk to her friends on the phone. But the conversations always seemed to circle back to the same thing: money. Every time someone asked how she was doing, she couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt for not being able to give a positive answer. She had always been self-sufficient. And now, she was asking for help. She hated it, but the truth was, Linda had never felt so alone. She had always prided herself on her independence, but now, her health and her finances were at the mercy of forces far beyond her control. The healthcare system, the policy changes, the rising costs, it all felt like a maze that she couldn't navigate. As the weeks went by, Linda started to notice the toll this uncertainty was taking on her health. She felt more fatigued than usual. Her blood sugar levels, despite her efforts to manage them with diet and exercise, were still higher than normal. The stress was wearing her down, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing control. One night, she found herself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, the silence of the room amplified by her thoughts. She had always been someone who could solve problems, who could find a way through any challenge. But now, with her health and finances in limbo, she didn't know what the solution was. There was no clear answer. No quick fix. She thought back to her initial diagnosis, how she had faced her diabetes head-on, made the necessary changes, and had lived with it for years. But this? This felt different. This wasn't just about managing her blood sugar levels, this was about surviving in a world that felt increasingly unstable. The very things she had relied on, her Medicare coverage, her savings, her independence, were now at risk. Linda closed her eyes, trying to push the anxiety away, but it lingered. The uncertainty was a constant companion, creeping into every part of her life. The fear of what might happen next kept her awake at night. What if she couldn't afford the insulin next month? What if her condition worsened without the proper treatment? The questions had no easy answers. And they consumed her. As she lay in the darkness, Linda realized that she couldn't keep going like this, living in a constant state of worry, trying to make her dollars stretch farther than they could. She needed a solution, but more importantly, she needed peace of mind. She couldn't afford to live this way forever. But where would that peace come from? And how could she find it when everything seemed so out of her control? Days turned into weeks, and the weight of Linda's struggle grew heavier. Every morning, she would wake up to the same grim reality: the price of insulin had skyrocketed, and she was still uncertain about how she was going to afford it. Her phone calls to various patient assistance programs were met with long waiting times and vague promises. The response was always the same: "We will get back to you." But as the days passed, Linda realized that getting back to her wasn't going to solve anything. She needed answers now. She sat at her kitchen table every morning, sipping her coffee and staring at the stack of bills that seemed to multiply by the day. The more she looked at the growing pile, the heavier it felt. Every bill she opened, electricity, rent, groceries, reminded her of how little she had left to cover the ever-increasing cost of her insulin. Linda had always been good with money, always able to make ends meet, but now it felt like she was sinking in quicksand. She had been trying to stay positive, to keep up her routine of healthy eating and exercise, but the stress was wearing her down. She had stopped going to her weekly yoga classes to save money. She had cut back on small pleasures like going out for coffee with friends. She even started skipping meals here and there, hoping to stretch her food budget further. But the more she tried to make sacrifices, the more she felt like she was losing a part of herself. It wasn't just the money that was draining her, it was the mental toll of constantly trying to stay afloat. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Linda sat on her couch, scrolling through articles online, looking for any possible way out. Her eyes were heavy from lack of sleep, and her thoughts were scattered. There were dozens of solutions being proposed for the insulin crisis, but none of them seemed feasible for her. Switch insurance plans. She had already tried that, and the premiums were too high. Buy generic insulin. She had heard stories about counterfeit products, and the thought of risking her health made her uneasy. It was then that Linda felt the full weight of her situation. She had always been proud of her ability to handle challenges, but this felt like something beyond her control. The policies from the government had impacted her life in ways she couldn't have predicted. No amount of careful budgeting or self-discipline could protect her from the financial burden of unaffordable insulin. In her quiet apartment, with the hum of the refrigerator the only sound, Linda thought about her future. Would she be forced to give up her independence? Would she have to ask for help? Something she had always avoided. She didn't want to admit it, but the fear was starting to creep in. The fear that she might not be able to keep up her healthy lifestyle without the right medications. The fear that her diabetes might spiral out of control, and there would be nothing she could do about it. The silence in her apartment felt suffocating. For the first time in a long while, Linda wondered if she had underestimated just how fragile her situation was. She had always been a survivor. She had faced challenges in the past and come out stronger on the other side. But now, it felt different. The uncertainty of her financial situation, paired with the rising costs of her medication, left her feeling powerless. Linda thought back to when she had first been diagnosed with diabetes. She had taken it in stride, making the necessary lifestyle changes and sticking to a routine that allowed her to live a relatively normal life. But now, with this new obstacle, it seemed like everything she had worked for, her health, her independence, her financial stability, was being threatened by forces beyond her control. The next morning, Linda woke up to the familiar routine of checking her blood sugar levels. Her fingers were numb from the stress, but she went through the motions. The numbers were stable for now, but she knew it wouldn't last long if she couldn't get her insulin. The thought of losing that stability, the thought of her health deteriorating because of a policy change, was too much to bear. She needed help, but the reality was clear: she didn't know where to turn. Her pride, the part of her that had always kept her going, was now being tested in ways she couldn't have imagined. It wasn't just about the insulin, it was about the fear of losing control over her own life. Linda had always prided herself on managing her health and her finances. But now, the stakes felt much higher. Linda stood by the window, looking out at the bright Texas sky. The sun was shining, but she couldn't shake the sense of dread that hung over her. She had spent so many years taking care of others, but now, she had to ask herself the hardest question of all: how do I take care of myself when the system I trusted has failed me? The quiet was unbearable. Linda sat on her couch in the dimly lit living room, her mind spinning as she stared at the medical bills scattered across the coffee table. The rising cost of insulin had started to feel like a mountain that she couldn't climb, and every attempt to push it out of her mind only made the pressure worse. Each bill she opened was another reminder of how much she was losing, how much she was being forced to sacrifice. It wasn't just about money anymore, it was about something deeper. Linda had always been independent, never wanting to ask for help. But now, she felt like she was standing at the edge of a precipice, looking down into an uncertain future. She had worked hard all her life, built a career, and managed her health with the utmost care. But the changes to Medicare and the skyrocketing costs of her medication were slowly unraveling everything she had worked for. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, as the weight of it all pressed down on her chest. The questions kept circling in her mind like an endless loop. What if I can't afford this next month? What if my condition worsens? The fear was like a shadow, following her everywhere, and she couldn't escape it. She had tried so hard to adjust. Changing her diet, exercising more, seeking out alternatives, but nothing seemed to ease the growing anxiety. Every choice she made felt like it was leading her further into uncertainty. She thought about selling some of her things, her car, maybe, just to make ends meet, but the idea of giving up the independence she had fought for felt like a betrayal to herself. She had always prided herself on being self-sufficient, but now, that wasn't enough. Nothing seemed to be enough. The room felt colder, and Linda pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. The lights outside her window flickered as a cold wind swept through the Texas evening. But it was nothing compared to the chill she felt in her own heart. She had always thought of herself as a survivor, someone who could weather any storm. But now, the storm felt too big, too overwhelming. No matter how much she tried to plan, she couldn't seem to catch up. The phone rang, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was her doctor's office, a number she knew well. Linda hesitated before answering, unsure of what this call might bring. When she picked up, the receptionist's voice was polite but distant. "Hello, Linda. I just wanted to remind you that it's time to schedule your next checkup. We also wanted to discuss your medication. Do you have everything you need?" Linda's throat tightened. Her eyes flicked to the pile of unpaid bills. She felt a wave of frustration rising within her, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm fine for now, just a little tight on funds. I'll schedule the appointment soon." The receptionist's tone shifted slightly. Almost apologetic. "I understand, but please don't delay getting the care you need. We want to make sure your diabetes is well managed, especially with the new changes to the cost of your insulin. If you need assistance, we can help with that." Linda's heart sank. She could feel the walls closing in. It wasn't just the cost of insulin anymore, it was the constant reminders that she was fighting a losing battle. Her health was now a negotiation. A price tag hung over every appointment, every prescription. She wasn't just fighting her condition, she was fighting the system. "I'll look into the assistance programs." "Thanks for the call," Linda replied, hanging up the phone, as she sat there in the silence that followed. Linda felt like she was drowning. She had been so careful, so disciplined with her finances and her health, and now, it felt like everything was slipping through her fingers. She couldn't help but wonder if this was what the rest of her life would look like, constantly adjusting, constantly worrying, never able to get ahead. The uncertainty was suffocating, and no matter how hard she tried to breathe, it felt like she couldn't escape it. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the night sky. The stars were faintly visible, scattered across the blackness, but they felt distant and unreachable. Linda thought about her future. What would it hold if she couldn't afford her insulin, if she couldn't keep up with the ever-rising costs? What kind of life would she have if her health deteriorated? The doubt was overwhelming. She had no answers, no clear path forward. And for the first time, Linda allowed herself to feel the full weight of her fear. It was no longer just about money, it was about the fear that her future had been taken from her, that the dreams she had for her retirement, for her independence, were now out of reach. But as she stared at the stars, Linda couldn't help but wonder, was this truly the end of her control over her life? Or was there still a way forward? The weeks following Linda's realization that her situation might not improve were some of the hardest she had ever faced. The uncertainty about her future, about her health, her finances, and her ability to maintain her independence, had settled into her bones. Every decision felt like a tightrope walk, and no matter how carefully she tread, it seemed like one wrong move could send her tumbling. She had always prided herself on being self-sufficient, but now she found herself unsure of how to keep her footing in a world that felt increasingly unstable. Still, Linda kept moving forward, even when it seemed like there was no clear way out. She continued her search for alternative solutions to her insulin problem, scouring the internet for any programs, discounts, or grants that could help her afford her medication. It was exhausting. Every day was a new round of phone calls, applications, and waiting on hold. But Linda was determined. She had always been a fighter, and this new challenge, though overwhelming, was something she refused to back down from. One afternoon, as she sat at her kitchen table reviewing yet another list of financial assistance programs, her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize, but something told her to pick up. "Hello, is this Linda?" The voice on the other end asked, warm and reassuring. "This is Linda," she replied, cautious but hopeful. "Hi, I'm Stephanie from the Texas Health Assistance Program. We received your application for insulin assistance, and I wanted to let you know that we've approved your request for help with the cost of your medication. You'll be receiving a voucher for discounted insulin soon." Linda sat back in her chair, the phone still pressed to her ear. She had to take a moment to process the words. She had applied for the program weeks ago, but she had long since stopped expecting a call. The reality of what Stephanie had just said slowly began to sink in. "Wait, you're saying I've been approved?" Linda asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, exactly. You'll be able to pick up your insulin at a significantly reduced cost. The voucher will cover most of the remaining balance, and you should be receiving it in the mail within the next few days. We know times have been difficult for many people, and we're doing our best to help where we can." Linda felt a wave of relief wash over her, the kind of relief she hadn't felt in weeks. She didn't even realize she had been holding her breath until she exhaled slowly. For the first time in what felt like forever, Linda allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of the hole she had found herself in. After hanging up the phone, Linda sat in silence for a few minutes, letting the news sink in. The relief was immense, but there was still a part of her that felt uneasy. She had been so focused on surviving, on just getting by, that she had neglected the larger question of how long this new assistance would last or how sustainable it was in the long run. Still, the glimmer of hope that had been missing for so long had finally returned. For now, she had a lifeline. That evening, after dinner, Linda went for her usual walk in the neighborhood, but tonight was different. The cool evening air felt refreshing on her face, and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees felt soothing. As she walked, she reflected on the journey she had been on. She had spent weeks feeling trapped, helpless, and alone, but today, something had changed. She had taken a step forward, and though it wasn't the ultimate solution, it was progress. The streetlights cast a warm glow over the sidewalk as Linda made her way down the familiar path. She felt stronger, more capable than she had in days. It wasn't just about the voucher for insulin, it was about the fact that she had kept going, that she had continued to search for solutions, even when the odds seemed stacked against her. She had refused to give up. When Linda returned home, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in weeks. She had found a way through this moment of hardship, and that small victory made all the difference. The future still felt uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Linda felt like she was in control again. The days after receiving the call from the Texas Health Assistance Program were a mixture of relief and lingering uncertainty for Linda. She had a solution for her insulin, at least for the time being, but it wasn't enough to silence the nagging voice in her head that kept reminding her how fragile her situation still was. The approval was a lifeline, but it felt temporary, and Linda knew she couldn't keep living in a state of constant worry. She had to make a decision about how to proceed, but the options were few and none were without risks. Linda had always prided herself on being able to solve her own problems, on finding a way to make things work, even in the toughest of times. But this was different. The changes in Medicare, the rising costs of healthcare, the uncertainty surrounding her future, these were forces she couldn't control. Her health, which had once been something she could manage with discipline and determination, now felt like a fragile thread, hanging by a mere strand. She sat at her kitchen table one evening, staring at the stack of bills, the reminder of all the challenges that lay ahead. The insulin voucher had brought her some relief, but it didn't solve the larger problem. What was she going to do next year? What about in 5 years? Would the costs continue to rise, or would there be new changes to Medicare that would make things worse? The uncertainty felt endless. And it weighed heavily on her shoulders. The phone rang, snapping Linda out of her thoughts. It was her daughter, Emma, calling from out of state. Linda smiled weakly, trying to push the anxiety aside. "Hey, Mom. How are you doing?" Emma's voice was cheerful, but Linda could hear the concern in it, too. "I'm doing okay, sweetheart. Just trying to get things figured out," Linda replied, forcing a smile into her voice. "You're not trying to do too much by yourself, are you?" Emma asked, her tone gentle but firm. Linda hesitated before answering. She hadn't wanted to burden Emma with her worries, but deep down, she knew her daughter could tell something was wrong. "It's just the cost of my insulin has gone up so much. I'm making do for now, but I don't know what'll happen in the future." Emma was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You know, Mom, you don't have to go through this alone. You've been there for me all my life. Let us help you. We're family, and we'll figure this out together." The words hung in the air, and Linda felt her throat tighten. She had spent so many years trying to protect her daughter from her struggles, trying to make sure Emma never saw her weaknesses. But now, she realized that her pride had prevented her from accepting help when she needed it most. Maybe it's time, Linda thought. She couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. She couldn't carry the weight of this alone anymore. Later that evening, after the call with Emma, Linda sat in her living room, reflecting on the conversation. She had always believed in independence, believed that asking for help was a sign of weakness. But now, she saw it differently. Accepting help didn't mean giving up control, it meant strengthening her support system, making sure she didn't have to face this challenge in isolation. The next morning, Linda called her daughter again. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began. "I think it's time for me to ask for help. Not just from you, but from my doctors, from the support groups. I've spent too long trying to handle this all on my own." Emma's voice was filled with relief and warmth. "I'm so glad you're saying that, Mom. We'll figure this out together, I promise." As Linda ended the call, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in weeks. The anxiety was still there, but it was no longer the only thing she could focus on. For the first time in a long while, Linda allowed herself to believe that she wasn't alone in this. There were people who cared for her, who were willing to help her find solutions, and that made all the difference. Linda sat back in her chair and looked out the window, where the sun was just beginning to rise. The light felt different this morning, warmer, gentler, as if it were offering her a new beginning. She didn't have all the answers, and she knew the road ahead would still be difficult. But for the first time in months, Linda felt like she was standing at the start of a new chapter, one where she didn't have to face everything alone. And that, she realized, was the first step in regaining control over her future.